We find in Genesis chapter 1, God creating the world. We find in Genesis chapter 2, that more focused picture of God making man. And then right after that, in Genesis chapter 3, we find the fall of man. So things go awry rather quickly. And then in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, we have the thesis statement of the whole Bible. We heard it earlier. God speaks to the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. You will bruise him on the heel, he will bruise you on the head. And the rest of the Bible is the outworking of that redemptive plan as we look forward to the coming of the person and work of Jesus Christ. We see his cross work, and then we see the anticipation of the consummation of all things in him at his second advent, for which we wait anxiously. And yet, we have come to a place where we treat the Bible as though this redemption is only a minor theme, or as though this redemption is something that we see only in the New Testament. In John chapter 5, what do we have recorded there in John chapter 5? At the end of John chapter 5, listen to these words. Beginning of verse 45, do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses, on whom you have set your hope. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? Moses wrote of you? What are you talking about, Jesus? Do you mean that we can go to the Pentateuch and find you and your redemptive work? Do you mean that when we go to the Old Testament, we don't have to read it like Aesop's fables? It's precisely what he means. This redemption is not something that is a second thought or an afterthought. It is something that we find in the pages of the Bible from beginning to end. So here's what I want to do. I want us to turn to a very familiar Old Testament passage, and I want us to see Jesus in all his glory. Now, as we do this, we must be careful. Here's what we don't do. We don't go to the Bible and allegorize it so that every little thing that we find there has to somehow symbolize some aspect of Christ. So we have to be careful there. But the other thing that we do is we don't go to the Old Testament and somehow read it as though Christ's redemptive work is insignificant. So what I want to do is go to a familiar passage in the Old Testament so that we can do a number of things. In Genesis chapter 41, we find the story of Joseph. And not just the story of Joseph, we find what is considered to be the apex in the Joseph story. In Genesis chapter 41, Joseph has already been in the pit. He has already been with Potiphar, and now he's been in prison, and he finds his way to the palace. All of that has already happened, and it is this moment at which he stands before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh announces his approval of Joseph. Joseph has interpreted 3 pairs of dreams in order to get to this point. By the way, that's very important. The first pair of dreams gets him into the pit, by the way. That's in Genesis chapter 37. There's 2 dreams. In the first dream, he comes to his brothers who already hate him, and as though it was a good idea, he tells them about his dream that basically foretells them bowing down to him. That didn't go well. He had another dream. And now not only does he tell his brother, but he tells his father. That goes even worse. It is after this that we see him in the pit. After being in the pit, eventually we see him in the prison. In prison, there's another pair of dreams. The baker and the cupbearer. One ends marvelously, the other, not so much. It is that pair of dreams that leads to his eventual release, although still 2 years later. And now he stands before Pharaoh, who asks for the interpretation of a pair of dreams. He interprets this pair of dreams. There are the ears of corn, the healthy ears and the sick ears, and the 7 sick ears gobble up the 7 healthy ears. There are the 7 healthy cows and the 7 sick cows, and the 7 sick cows gobble up the 7 healthy cows. And he looks at Pharaoh and says, there are going to be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. Store up during the years of plenty so that you have food to eat during the years of famine. And it is at this moment that we see what, for the most part, is considered the payoff in Joseph's life. And so in Sunday school, here's how it goes. Joseph was hated by his brothers. Have you ever been hated by anybody? And because they hated him, they mistreated him. And after they mistreated him, he went through some bad circumstances. Have you ever experienced bad circumstances? Yes. But because he endured the bad circumstances, he held on, and God was with him. And as a result of that, God elevates him to the 2nd highest position in all of Egypt. The moral of the story is, if you will but trust God, even when people despise you, God will eventually reward you and elevate you to a position of prominence, just like Joseph. Really? That's why Genesis 41 is in the Bible. I beg to differ. In fact, here's what I would argue. If you are reading Genesis for the first time and you come to Genesis chapter 41, if you are an honest reader who's been paying attention, when you get to Genesis chapter 41, you don't stand up and cheer for Joseph, you fall on your face and pray for him. Because this could be the most perilous moment of all of the moments that he has experienced. I know that look. That's the look that says, really? Yeah, really. Let me explain. Genesis chapter 41, beginning at verse 37. Let's see this here. And we have to see this in its grammatical, historical, biblical context in order to understand where Christ and his redemptive work fits here, because we're not just going to allegorize. So look here, beginning verse 37. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? Pharaoh was not just converted, folks. What he means there is that this is revelation that comes from somewhere beyond the human. Pharaoh's not saying the Spirit of God in the same way that you and I understand the Spirit of God. Pharaoh thought himself to be a god. But what he is acknowledging here is that there is something divine about what this young man just did. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Stop. Now, all of a sudden, he's gone from the pit to Potiphar to prison, and now power in the palace before Pharaoh. And we say, this is the payoff moment. I don't think so. He's part of the covenant community. God has made a covenant with his great-grandfather Abraham. And the covenant that he made with his great-grandfather Abraham is not that your descendants will serve pagan kings. But that's precisely what's happening right now with Pharaoh. Joseph is second in command to a pagan king whose very existence is blasphemous before a holy God. This blasphemous king who thinks that he is a God says to a covenant child of the Most High God, you are now my servant to prop up my kingdom where I am God. Really? That's what we want for our children? Mamas come crying to their pastors when this happens to their sons. I don't know what's wrong. We raised him right. And now he's this big, powerful muckety-muck, serving the pagans, giving his life to those individuals. No longer committed, it seems, to the covenant people of God. It's not scriptural, but it's true. Lord Acton was right. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And now here he is in power. Jesus warns about power, does he not? About those who lord it over others, and about those who would be great being servants, not being in power, certainly not having pagan power. But there's more. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him in garments and fine linen and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot, and they called out before him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. By the way, make no mistake about it. There is an intentional reference here to bowing the knee that goes back to the first pair of dreams that Joseph has interpreted. Joseph interprets this dream. His brothers are going to bow the knee before him. Rather than bow the knee before him, his brothers would rather kill him, we see in Genesis chapter 37. And we know that they don't just mean that figuratively, because they've proven that they are murderers. Do you remember the Shechemites? Your family didn't accept you. The covenant community didn't accept you. But that's okay. The pagans will bow the knee. But not just that. He's got the signet ring. He's got the linen clothing. And he's riding in a Bentley. To what else would you compare Pharaoh's second chariot? Now, not only does he have pagan power, but he has pagan wealth. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And now, not only does Joseph have power, but he has great wealth. And again, in the Sunday school lesson, this is why you hold on. You hold on because if you hold on when people mistreat you, ultimately God will elevate you and give you great power and great wealth. And after all, that's what life is all about, is it not? We continue. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift up hand or foot in all of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphanath-Paneah. Now he has a pagan name, a pagan identity. Are you beginning to see this? Here's what's ironic to me. We get to Genesis chapter 41 and we say, this is the payoff moment. Really? This is the payoff moment. Yes, of course this is a payoff moment. All I've seen so far is that this man is serving a pagan king. He has pagan wealth and all the accoutrement that goes on with being in power in a pagan culture. And now he's been given a pagan identity. Why is it that in Genesis chapter 41 we praise this, but in Daniel 1 we decry it? They get their names changed. They get a pagan identity. They're serving a pagan king, and we say, woe to them. This guy gets the exact same thing. And in fact, it's his story that would have given Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah the courage to continue on in Babylon. Why? Because they want pagan wealth, and that's what Genesis 41 is all about? No. The exact opposite. There's a final piece of the puzzle. And he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Now he's got a pagan wife. Let's recap. God makes a covenant with his people. This covenant with his people has to do with the promised seed that is going to come and continue on. It has to do with a place, this promised land, and it has to do with blessing from them to the nations. Now, Joseph, who is beginning to experience the first fruits of the covenant people of God living in the land of promise, is taken away from his father, away from the covenant community, away from the land of promise, into a pagan land where he has pagan power, pagan wealth, a pagan identity, and a pagan wife. And we say, hold on, children, you can have that too. If this is the way we interpret Genesis chapter 41, why do we get angry if a young man grows up, leaves the church, marries an unbeliever, and then gives his entire life to a corporation living in order to attain material wealth and completely ignoring the spiritual side of his life? Because if you challenge him on it, all he has to do is go back to his Sunday school lesson on Genesis 41 and say, why are you angry? Shouldn't you instead be telling your friends, look at what happened to my boy because he endured hardship? There's another reason why this cannot be the apex and what Genesis chapter 41 is all about. Look at the second reason. The second reason you find beginning in verse 50. Before the year famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore them to him. He's got 2 sons who were born. By the way, born by whom? Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of one of the 2 most powerful pagan priesthoods in all of Egypt. She's the one who bore them to him. So now he's having children. Now, watch what happens here in the naming of his sons, and you will discover that Joseph doesn't think that Genesis chapter 41 is the payoff moment. Joseph called the name of his firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. 3 things. Number 1, he gave his boys Hebrew names. He did not give them Egyptian names. He says to everyone who is paying attention, I do not consider myself an Egyptian. I'm a Hebrew. I'm a member of the covenant people of God. I am not one of these people. This is not my payoff moment. This is not as good as it gets. Secondly, the name of his firstborn boy. I've forgotten all my hardship and all my father's house. It's very difficult to translate this from the Hebrew, but that name Manasseh does not mean I have forgotten that I belong to my father's house. It can't mean that because he gives him a Hebrew name. What does it mean? It means that I have forgotten all of that hardship in my father's house that led me to this place. Can I give you my own translation of what the name Manasseh means? The name Manasseh means I let that stuff go. That's what Manasseh means. I do not choose to define myself by the difficulties that have encountered me up to this point in my journey with God. Oh, Joseph, embrace Egypt. Egypt embraces you and your family didn't. I let that stuff go. Oh, Joseph, embrace Egypt. Your brothers did not want to bow. These people do. I let that stuff go. Joseph, embrace Egypt. It was because of your brothers that you spent years as a slave. I let that stuff go. Embrace Egypt. It was because of your brothers that you ended up in prison. I let that stuff go. I do not define myself by those things. Instead, I look to the promise of God. The name of his second-born, Ephraim. God has prospered me in the land of my affliction. Did you catch that? Joseph says Egypt is the land of his affliction, not the land of payoff. Egypt is the land of his affliction. Yeah, but you're rich here. It's the land of my affliction. Yeah, but they love you here. It's the land of my affliction. Why? Because this is not what I was living for. I'm a child of the covenant. I'm a child of the one true God. I'm a servant of the King of heaven. I don't exist to serve the king of Egypt. So, number one, this is not the payoff moment, because if you just look at the narrative, these are not the things that we look forward to. But secondly, if you look at the naming of his sons, Joseph didn't even see this as a payoff moment. So here's the question. Why Genesis chapter 41? I'm so glad you asked. Joseph himself answers this question when his brothers show up. He finally reveals himself to his brothers. He cannot control himself anymore. And when he reveals himself to his brothers, here's what doesn't happen. Joseph does not look to his brothers and say, I'm Joseph. I'm the one you sent into slavery. I'm the one that you wanted to murder. I'm the one that you did not want to bow before, but you've been bowing before me ever since you came to Egypt. I'm the one that you didn't think much of, but now God has made much of me. I am the one that you thought God gave too much favor from his father. Now I'm the one that God has favored before the most powerful man in the world. See, that's what you would have said. How do I know that? Because that's what I would have said. But what does Joseph say to his brothers? I'm your brother, Joseph, when you sold into slavery. And just when they could feel the noose around their necks, he says, do not be angry with yourselves, because God sent me here. To save you. What? Joseph does not say, God sent me here to give me all the things that Egypt had to offer. Joseph says, God sent me here because God is a rescuer. God sent me here to rescue you in spite of you. You didn't like my dreams, but newsflash, do you know that we were a wealthy family because God spoke to our father through dreams? And when I began to dream, why did you not realize that God was again speaking to our family through dreams? God was showing me through a dream this very moment when he would rescue you. And when God brought his word through me that said he would rescue you, your answer was to kill the rescuer. Familiar? But I'm not mad, because I let that stuff go. And this is not my home. But if Genesis 41 wasn't about Joseph, who's it about? Actually, briefly, let me explain. God makes a promise in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. This promise involves the promised seed. He pronounces this promise in a curse against the serpent. The serpent believes exactly what God says, which is why in Genesis chapter 4 we have the first murder. What is the first murder? The seed of the serpent, Cain, kills the seed of the woman, Abel. What happens after that? In chapter 4, at the end of it, on into chapter 5, we get the announcement of the coming of Seth and the restoration of the godly seed. Then in chapter 5, we get a genealogy. And so there are 10 generations from Adam to Noah through the godly line of Seth. God wipes out the world in the flood, and he preserves Noah, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and their wives. Why is this important? Because you've got to have husbands and wives in order to have seed. The seed that was promised still had not come to fruition. Eventually, you come to a man named Terah who has an offspring by the name of Abraham. God makes a promise to that man named Abraham, and this promise involves, among other things, seed. But this promise is rather significant because he and his wife, particularly his wife, too old for seed. So how do you get promised seed if the seed-bearing woman is too old for seed? The answer is God must intervene. No. The answer is we got to find somebody else. Hagar. Wrong answer. God didn't say a seed, he said the seed. Ishmael was a seed, but not the seed. Isaac is the seed. Isaac then goes on, and they have twins. Which one is it going to be? Certainly it's going to be the older. No, this is not about birth order. This is about election. The older will serve the younger. So it's not Esau, it's Jacob. Jacob goes forth, and if seed is going to come, certainly Jacob's got to find a wife. He goes to Laban, and he meets Laban's daughter and falls in love and thinks he's found the one. 7 years he works, and he gets married and wakes up next to the other one. And you thought it was a love story, but it was not a love story, it was an election story. The one whom he loves cannot bear children. Told way later in the story when she gives birth to a son named Joseph and then one named Benjamin, and then she dies. Joseph is loved above all of his brothers because he was the beloved son of the beloved wife, but he was not the promised seed. The woman that he didn't even want, when her sister couldn't have children, she did. And she proceeded to give birth to Reuben, Simeon, Levi, the father of the priesthood, and Judah. And as we come to this story, in Genesis chapter 37, we are introduced to Joseph. In Genesis chapter 38, there seems to be a chapter that's out of place because now we read about Judah and Tamar, the worst moment in Judah's life. Why is that there in the midst of the story about Joseph? Because it's not about Joseph, it's about Judah. Well, why show Judah at his lowest point? Because God has to redeem Judah for him to take his place as the head of the family and to be identified as the promised seed because of the electing work of God. And so God redeems Judah. And in what moment do we see Judah's redemption? When Judah says to his father, Jacob, send me with the boy Benjamin. I know you love him. And if anything happens to him, I will be his substitute. Joseph tries them. And he takes Benjamin and says, I'm keeping this one. Jacob says, it'll kill my daddy. Take me instead of my brother as his substitute and put his punishment upon me in order that my father may be pleased by his redemption. Does that sound familiar? Judah goes on to have a son. It's a great-grandson, and his name is David. David, just like his father Judah, shows up on the scene like this great-grandfather of his, and what does he do when he shows up on the scene? when he's finally identified and the promised seed brings forth his presence with authority, he walks down into a valley where there's been a giant who made this proposition: send me a man to fight with me. If he defeats me, we will serve you. If I defeat him, you will serve me. David goes down, fights the giant as the representative substitute for God's people, wins victory over the giant, thereby winning victory on behalf of all of God's people. There's a covenant made with him. And that covenant promises the throne and the king. And great King David, descendant of Judah, eventually has a greater son who is a greater king, who is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. The New Testament opens up with a genealogy. And basically that genealogy screams the God who made a promise in Genesis chapter 3 has fulfilled that promise. These are the line of the promised seed who will crush the head of the snake. And what does great King David's greater son Jesus do? Like his forebears, David and Judah, he stands as a substitute on behalf of God's elect, lays down his life, accepts the wrath of God poured out upon him that he might win victory on behalf of God's people, that all of those who are found in him might be rescued. Why is Genesis chapter 41 important? Because God rescues Joseph in order to rescue Judah, in order to rescue Israel, in order to rescue me. This is not about material wealth. This is about rescue and redemption. This is about God in his providence orchestrating all of history in order to bring about that which we need more than anything else, and that is to be rescued from God. The first Adam ate, and we all died in him. The last Adam died, and as a result, we shall all feast with him. This is why not only Genesis 41, but the whole Old Testament matters and makes sense. Because it points to God's redeeming, rescuing work in the person of Christ. Therefore, regardless of where your story ends up, you must find its significance in the ultimate portrait of God's work of redemption and rescue. If you don't, you are settling for something far less significant, and you have completely missed your greatest need.
Joseph stands in Egypt clothed in power, yet he is surrounded by paganism. He receives wealth, a new name, and authority, but he does not lose his covenant identity. He gives his sons Hebrew names, and though he rules the land, he still calls Egypt a land of affliction. Prosperity in exile is not the promise fulfilled. This is not Joseph's triumph. It is God's providence. And the parallels to Christ are unmistakable. Joseph was rejected by his brothers. Jesus was rejected by his own. Joseph was sold for silver. Jesus was betrayed for silver. Joseph was falsely accused and condemned though innocent. So was Christ. Joseph descended into prison before ascending to power. Christ descended into death before rising in glory. Joseph was exalted to the right hand of Pharaoh. Jesus is exalted to the right hand of God. Joseph became the means of physical salvation to those who once rejected him. Jesus becomes the means of eternal salvation to those who pierced him. When famine came, the world had to go to Joseph for bread. When sin brings death, the world must go to Christ, the bread of life. Joseph preserved the covenant family so the promised seed would come through Judah, through David, and ultimately through Jesus. Joseph rescued from hunger for a season. Christ rescues from wrath forever.